So having talked about what indulgences are, now we can kind of look at the guy who started the Reformation, Martin Luther. Luther was a German monk, born in the late 15th century. And kind of interesting life. He came from a sort of well-to-do middle-class German family. He originally was going to become a lawyer, but one day while he was trying to run to school, he got caught in a thunderstorm, and he prayed that if he was spared from this storm, he'd become a monk. He was, so he did. And he was pretty well educated. In fact, he worked at the University of Wittenberg, and he was a member of the Dominican order, which is a teaching order. So for a long time, he taught theology at this university in Wittenberg. And he was always sort of known to be, pretty scrupulous. He was worried about his soul and how much sinning he did and how he'd really sort of justify himself as a religious person. And he went to Rome one day on sort of a diplomatic mission and was sort of surprised at how worldly people were. The priests would rush through their masses, and then they'd go and, eat and drink and do other things that seemed that, priests and monks should do, things that he wouldn't do. But in any case, the big change for Luther comes when this guy Johann Tetzel, one of the indulgence preachers, comes into town. And he sees Tetzel's preaching and really feels like Tetzel is warping what indulgences are supposed to be. And he gets worried about the whole idea of indulgences. It seems kind of unfair that rich people could buy these indulgences and sort of buy their way out of sinning in his mind. So Luther decides to sort of write a letter about this. And he writes this letter called the 95 Theses. They're 95 specific sentences or theses against the selling of indulgences. And he sends this to his boss, the Archbishop of Mainz. And originally, that was sort of Luther's idea, it seems, is just sort of say, hey, I don't like this, here's my argument against it, from monk to his boss. And it's fairly polite in the way he's addressing the Archbishop, but he gets pretty intense in the actual argument against the idea of selling indulgences. Supposedly, Luther nailed these indulgences to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, although there's no real evidence of that. But most importantly is that eventually these get copied on the printing press. And within a few years, there's 30,000 copies of these floating around Europe. And that becomes a real problem later for Luther and for the church. But as Luther, writes this in 1517, he gradually starts to develop some ideas about religion that are different from what the Catholic Church teaches. Again, I don't want to dive too much into theology, but we kind of need to get a basis for what Luther's ideas were. So to focus on a few of them, probably the two most important doctrines or teachings that Luther had was sola fide and sola scriptura. Sola fide in Latin means faith alone. The Catholic Church taught that to achieve salvation, to get to heaven, you need two things. You need faith, right? Faith in God, in Jesus, and everything the Church teaches. But also you need good works. Basically, you need to take that faith and do something with it. Luther, in his reading of the Bible, thought that works really didn't do anything, that it was only faith that got you into heaven. Part of this is a repudiation of indulgences. Remember the idea that you buy an indulgence, you're doing a good work because you're donating money. So part of sola fide is Luther repudiating that. Another idea was sola scriptura, and sola scriptura means Bible alone, or Scripture alone. The Catholic Church's teachings, gradually developed over the course of 1,500 years. And while certainly a lot of it came directly from the Bible, other parts of the Catholic teaching came from what the Church called sacred tradition, things that, the early Church Fathers and the Apostles had done and taught. Luther said that if it's not in the Bible, you can't teach it as religiously true. So he had this idea that only true religious teaching come from the Bible and nowhere else. These two beliefs are going to be sort of bedrock beliefs of Protestantism, generally speaking, later. Two other important doctrines. One was the idea of the priesthood of believers. Remember that in the Catholic Church you have a specific priesthood. there are sacraments. The only people who can do the sacraments are ordained priests who are sort of separate from regular lay people. Luther had the idea that if you were baptized and if you were a Christian, you inherited this priesthood. And that meant you could read the Bible on your own and interpret it on your own. Whereas the Catholic Church had always taught that, it was the job of priests to interpret. One thing to keep in mind here is that, most people still couldn't read. So one of the arguments in favor of having a priest interpret the Bible was that, well, most people can't read. Books are hard to come by until the invention of the printing press. And so therefore is the job of priests to really interpret. But Luther has this belief that, again, is going to be very important to other reformers, that anyone who's Christian can interpret the Bible on their own. And that's going to be key later on. Another of Luther's distinct doctrines is the idea of the two kingdoms. Remember that going back to like the 6th century, maybe it was the 8th century, a while back in the Middle Ages. Pope Gregory had argued that the church, or the Pope, basically has these two swords, the sword of the spirit and the sword of the temporal kingdom. In other words, that the Pope rules over both religious stuff and earthly stuff, that the Pope can intervene in the affairs of the world. Luther argued that God worked through these two different things: the spiritual kingdom, that is to say, like people's individual souls, and the temporal kingdom, which is to say, governments. And what Luther was arguing here essentially was that you don't need a pope to rule over either of these things. God rules directly through both of them. And what this means effectively is that most of the time on earth, when it comes to laws and that kind of stuff, the temporal kingdom, that is to say princes and emperors and kings, ought to have power over regular people. In other words, he cuts the Pope out of political reform. But essentially this also means that in most day-to-day things, the state, government rulers, have authority over regular people. And that's going to be important later on as we look at how Luther's